Welcome to this special program on Kairali channel. This is a panel conversation between Professor Noam Chomsky of University Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and two leading experts in the field of the mass media in India, N. Ram, who is editor of Frontline and also editor of Business Line and Sports Star, and Sashi Kumar, the chairman of the Media Development Foundation, which has established in Chennai the Asian College of Journalism. Noam Chomsky is perhaps the world's most renowned academic scholar. He is the founder of the modern science of linguistics. He is a social theorist, activist, a media critic, and author of many books, philosopher, and a great inspiration to people involved in anti-imperialist activism all over the world. Two issues which have appeared in Noam's work. One is to give too much prominence to one incident, and not see the entire context. There's yet another, a methodological point, which he always makes, is that when you assess the deaths caused by an attack, you don't assess the number of people who died in that incident. No? Because if 5 people die when you destroy a pharmaceutical factory, and that pharmaceutical factory is producing life-saving drugs for millions of people, then those millions must count as part of the victims of that bomb.
It's like starvation deaths, starvation related.
Exactly. So it's, and I think this has, of course, appeared in your recent controversy with Christopher Hitchens, yes. That you don't just measure the number of people who die then, but or look at Iraq. Iraq, it's not just the people who died in '91, but the many millions who died since then.
And that's all over the world. I mean, take, say, Laos, one of the poorest countries in the world. In the late 1960s, there was what was called a secret bombing of northern Laos. It was secret because the media knew all about it and refused to print it. And I can tell you that from personal experience, from meetings with the editorial board of the New York Times and Time Life and so on. The information was there, they would not print it. I happened to be there shortly after and interviewed refugees and so on. This was bombing in northern Laos, had nothing to do with the Indochina wars. The government admitted that. It's a poor peasant area with, which at that time was became the most heavily bombed area in the world. Now, right now, by now there are millions, literally millions of unexploded, what are called bomblets, the little pieces of cluster bombs that don't explode. There's about a 20-30% failure rate, presumably in order to kill more people. Now, if a child picks up one of these little things, flechettes come out and murder him. If a farmer hits one with a hoe, same thing. There are literally millions of them. Now, the number of people dying in northern Laos is not really known, but the aid workers, church volunteer demining groups, I mean, they estimate thousands killed a year. In fact, the Asian Wall Street Journal, their Asia correspondent, Barry Wayne, he accepted the figure of 10,000 deaths a year as possible. He didn't say it's true, he said it could be possible. Well, that's going on right now. This is more than 30 years after the war's over. There's a British demining team, a volunteer demining team trying to deal with it. The Pentagon, to this day, will not give them technical information about how to defuse the unexploded bomblets. Well, these are all casualties of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War may be over, but these people are still dying. I mean, the people still dying from cancer because of chemical warfare in the South, they're dying. And incidentally, we understand this perfectly when we study an enemy. So if you take, say, the Chinese famine, maybe the greatest crime of communism, in the indictments of communism, the Chinese famine of 1958 to 61. Mao didn't shoot those people. There were just decisions made at a central level which led to a lot of people starving. And those deaths are properly attributed to the central authorities. They didn't take a gun and shoot them. They didn't intend to kill them. It was a decision that led to mass death, and that's a crime. Actually, Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen, in their comparison of India and China, discuss this in some detail, and they correctly describe it as a political crime. It's a crime that has its roots in the ideological and institutional structure of communist China. And that has received an enormous amount of publicity when Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize. However, they say something else in the same place. They compare it with India. And they say if you compare China and India, which began roughly at the same level in the time of independence, and you look at the policies that were taken, and you compare mortality rates, they say because of China's rural health programs and others, they've lowered the mortality rate. What they say is, this is a virtual quote, that every 8 years, India puts as many skeletons in its closet as China killed during the
died in China during the famine.
Yeah. Now, when we that part of their discussion never entered public, the public domain. Yeah. But that's correct. We should apply the same standards to ourselves we apply to others. I mean, take, say, Pol Pot. The CIA did a demographic study after the war was over, and don't know how trustworthy it is, but their estimate, at least, is that the number of people actually killed by Pol Pot was 50 to 100,000. But the number of deaths attributed to him are maybe 1.5 million or something like that. Well, those deaths are not people who were killed. They're people who died as a result of the policies. The Sudan case, which you mentioned, the pharmaceutical factory, the number of people killed in the bombing was a handful, 2 or 3 people. But this is a factory which produced half the pharmaceutical supplies for the country, all the veterinary medicines, meaning which for livestock, which mean people's deaths too. It produced 90% of the essential drugs. What were the consequences? Well, the West doesn't care, so nobody looks. But there have been some people who looked. The German embassy in Sudan looked at it. Their conclusion is that several tens of thousands of people died. There is one expert, a person, the regional representative of one of the major relief agencies for the Near East, who does field work in Sudan, so he knows the area. His estimate is about the same. Tens of thousands of people died. Well, in the West, this is unknown. And when you mention it, it's considered scandalous to mention it. It's scandalous to mention the fact that we kill people the same way Mao does, or the same way Pol Pot does. So yes, it's fine. The methodological point is kind of dual. We're allowed to understand it when we're talking about an enemy. It's scandalous to apply it to ourselves. Now, if we turning to the present case, the number of deaths in Afghanistan is incalculable. And you're not going to see them. People don't die from starvation in an instant. I mean, they eat grass or roots, and they may drag on for a while. And then their children will die because they're born, too low a birth weight or ill. Yeah. And if you calculate the actual effects of the quite calculated savagery of destroying cities and driving people into the countryside or across the border, it could be millions of people.
Numbers.
Could be millions of people.
But to get to this example of a natural disaster, and in India, the point has also been made that the press, the media, acted as an early warning system, and that helped mitigate somewhat the circumstances. I'd like to take your
in the case of the famines.
Famines, yes.
Yeah, hunger as crisis.
But not in the case of the 8 million skeletons put in the closet every 8 years.
Yeah. But I'd like to see this alongside with your views on the media as a celebrated phrase, manufacturing consent. Do you see the media as responsible or accountable for more information or more disinformation? And what's your take on this?
Dam, you have something to add to that? Shashi's?
Yeah, I have a follow-up. I'll wait for you.
Well, at the point you make, first of all, at the role of the Indian media in preventing famines, that's an important one, and it's one that Sen and Drèze also make. As part of to the extent that India has a kind of a democratic society, information flows from the ground to the central authorities, and they'll know if there's a famine taking place, and one hopes, respond to it. And their point is, in China, this wasn't true.
Yes.
They say the central authorities simply didn't know. It's a totalitarian state. There was no information flowing back. They did not know that their plans were in fact causing a major famine. And that's the reason that Sen and Dresden give for the fact that India hasn't had major famine since the end of the colonial period. It's been able to. So that's a positive contribution of the media as part of a democratic society. On the other hand, insofar as the media act as essentially a state propaganda agency, which they do, every time you turn on CNN or BBC, you're seeing that, they are marginalizing information or eliminating it. I mean, they may show a picture of a refugee camp with a child who's dying, but they're not telling you Tony Blair and George W. Bush are purposely murdering huge masses of people. When they talk about the September 11th attacks, they're very clear about it. Yes. This was carried out by evil terrorists who have to be eliminated. And yes, that's legitimate, and a great bitterness and anger and horror, which is correct. You should respond that way. When they refer to the atrocities, the much worse atrocities that their own governments are carrying out, it's a different thing altogether. I mean, it's some event that's happening, unfortunate, in part as part of our pursuit of a just and legitimate war. No passion, no emotion. If anybody's to blame, it's the Taliban or the drought or whatever. In fact, we can be confident that when all of this is over in some horrifying way, and it will be impossible to conceal the fact that lots of people died, it'll be blamed on natural disasters. The drought, the Taliban that wouldn't let relief workers in, or a mistake, maybe we went the wrong place or something, but not on the purposeful, calculated savagery of a project aimed at assassination, much like Winston Churchill's. Yes. I mean, the people who died from poison gas and the Air Force, well, nobody counts them. And in fact, like I say, we'll never find out about them because they've removed the record.
But do you see this as a homogeneous behavior by the media? Isn't there the oppositional media? Isn't there Al Jazeera, for instance, which... Well,
there is Al Jazeera, which is an interesting case. It's the one independent news channel in the whole Arab world. And it is, I mean, I don't watch it all the time, obviously, but it's quite broad. I mean, I've been on it, for example. Colin Powell, Secretary of State's been on it. Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel.
And Tony Blair demanded equal time.
Tony Blair demanded equal time. Osama bin Laden's on it. And they have discussion programs where people call in. And apparently it's very free and open. Everyone who watches it says it's free and open. It exposes the corruption and violence of the governments. It does all sorts of things. Well, all the governments in the region despise it, naturally, and have been trying to get Qatar, where it's based, to suppress it. Yes. Recently, the U.S. joined in. Colin Powell, urged the Emir of Qatar to, as he put it, rein in Al Jazeera. Yes. That is, don't allow it to be used for purposes other than our propaganda. He didn't put it that way, but that's what it amounts to. The Emir happened to be in Washington and held a press conference in Washington in which he told the press, well, we're under pressure by the State Department to rein in this television station, just as we are from the Arab government. But we're going to defend freedom of press, so we're going to allow the station to continue. And he was saying that in Washington, press conference. It was reported accurately in one newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, had an accurate, honest report. Others had a few sentences and didn't say what it meant. But yes, Al Jazeera is in fact, Al Jazeera is the only news channel that has had correspondents in Afghanistan. Yes. The destruction of the Buddha statues. I mean, that was their, they reported it. They saw it, filmed it, and reported it, and many other things. And as long as they were talking about crimes of the Taliban, they were just fine. But when they start talking about crimes of the United States, you better rein them in, because we can't allow that. Actually, that's quite normal. During the bombing, one of the major NATO atrocities during the bombing of Serbia was the destruction of the television station. Yes. They bombed the television station and killed a couple of dozen people, and the reason was stated quite clearly. They warned Serbia that this television station would be bombed unless they allowed NATO 6 hours on the television station. I mean, that's like Hitler asking Britain for 6 hours of time on the BBC. Well, the Serbs refused, and then they bombed the station,
Yes.
and that was considered legitimate. Actually, that came up in the war crimes trials, and they considered it, but of course didn't consider it a crime. It was just part of, and they accepted a ludicrous excuse, namely that the television station was sending out signals that were used for military purposes.
A follow-up on manufacturing consent. May I say that media analysis has never been the same since that book appeared, I believe, in 1988, and you have also the Chomsky nuances and analysis, I think, must be somewhat separately looked at, because it's seen as part of a wider system of intellectual consensus building, which is a very, very interesting analysis. Now, Noam, your work with a lot of it in collaboration with Ed Herman is based on, you state right at the outset, on your belief that based on your experience with US media over a long period, it evolved, and you apply it to the performance of the American media. I'm going to, if there's time, I could like to raise two lines of questions. First, the working of the filters, the well-known filters, the 5 filters identifier, and a metaphor is used that as a result of the operation of the filters, all the news that fits to print, that's what is got as a residue after this almost chemical process is over. How current is the operation of these filters? And I have a follow-up on that as well.
Right.
What's the second? Well, you can take follow-up.
The second is, how do we apply this to, can this be applied, your model, the propaganda model, to media performance in other countries, European countries for a start, and then India? What's your thinking as a model builder?
Well,
And also, is it more or less in Europe and Britain? Is there
Difference in
yes,
degree,
Because
difference in
they
the-
interview
are
him
they
all the time, for example.
Yeah.
That's a breach
Right.
in the,
Yeah.
in the
Well,
manufacture of consent.
However, let's take Ram's question. one
first of
by
all,
one.
this was a joint book, as you said. Ed Herman, who's an economist, very good economist, actually the work on the filters is mostly his work. I mean, I sort of agreed to it, but I see it a little bit differently. In fact, the title of the book illustrates it. The phrase manufacturing consent is not our phrase. We took it
Walter
from
Lippmann.
Walter Lippmann, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century and the leading figure in the United States and the leading media figure in the 20th century. He used that phrase in a book in the 1920s.
Public opinion.
On, yes, and which are considered progressive essays on democracy. He was a Wilsonian progressive. And he talked about what he called the art of democracy. And he said the art of democracy requires manufacture of consent. And the reason is that the public has to be excluded from the democratic process. If a democracy is to function, the public has to be excluded. The reason is the public is ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. That's his phrase. They are a bewildered herd. And we have to protect the responsible men, the real decision makers, from the roar and trampling of the bewildered herd. And since we can no longer do this by force, because the country has become more democratic, we have to do it by controlling opinion. So he's not simply talking about the media, he's talking about the intellectual community. The role of the responsible intellectual is to ensure that the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, namely the public, don't become involved in something that's none of their business.
He also thought Asia and Africa are beyond redemption.
They didn't even talk about that. He didn't even have to say it. I mean, he's talking about the democratic
Western
societies. It's rather. Britain had the same development took place in England, the two most democratic societies in the world, and it's very striking that that should be the case. Actually, these are observations that go back centuries. back to the 17th century, first democratic revolution in England. It was recognized right away. We can't simply control people by violence any longer. We're going to have to control their opinions. David Hume talks about this. But in the First World War, there was a radical change, a big effect on the 20th century and since. In the First World War, Britain created what was called a Ministry of Information, which of course means Ministry of Disinformation. And its main purpose was to convince American intellectuals to join the war effort, which Britain badly needed. So they developed all the propaganda you've heard about, Belgian babies with their arms torn off and Hun atrocities and so on. Most of this was produced within the British Ministry of Information, beamed to U.S. intellectuals, who then picked it up and tried to drive the population into jingoist hysteria. In part, it was their own choice, and they're very proud of it. They say this is the first war in history organized by intellectuals, the responsible, serious people, and not saying we're repeating British propaganda fabrications. But the Wilson administration didn't take any chances either. It set up a Committee on Public Information, the first U.S. official state propaganda agency, which was designed to convert a pacifist population into anti-German fanatics, and it succeeded. And they were very impressed. A lot of people were impressed. The success of the state propaganda agencies was very impressive. Lippmann was part of the Committee on Public Information, and he was using that experience when he was writing that
Theorizing
book.
about it.
So intellectuals were, and it became some of the foundations of modern political science. If you read the standard Harold Lasswell, others, they said, yes, we should not. Lasswell was one of the founders of the modern science, so-called. He wrote an article called Propaganda in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences about that time, in which he said we should not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. They're too stupid. We're the best judges of their interests. But since they now have the franchise and they have parliamentary labor parties and so on, we can't just control them by force. So therefore we have to ensure that they have the right thoughts. And that's our responsibility as serious Democrats. That's the academic side. Others who were impressed, and this is more important really, is the business world. The business world recognized that these are fantastic tools for controlling people. And the huge public relations industry, of which advertising is a component, and it's a monstrous industry, that grew out of this. If you look at its manuals from the 1920s and later, they're very explicit about it. These are incidentally, progressives. Roosevelt, Kennedy, liberals. They're the commissars of the Western societies, and they're very straight. They say we have to regiment the public mind the same way an army regiments their bodies. We have to engineer consent, and that's the essence of democracy. The essence of democracy is for leadership to engineer consent among the bewildered herd, the public, and direct them to something else. We have to impose on them what was called a philosophy of futility, a feeling they can't do anything. We have to direct them to the insignificant things in life, like consumption or some other thing, but just keep them out of our hair. Let us run. We have to be the decision makers, the analysts, and so on. Now, a lot of this is self-serving fraud, because if you ask who the responsible men are, well, it's the people who serve real power. So Walter Lippmann was a responsible man because he's working for power. But Eugene Debs, who's the leading U.S. figure in the labor movement, was in jail, because he said the war wasn't a just war. So you become a responsible man if you serve real power. Then you see yourself as responsible and a proper decision maker. And then, insofar as you do serve power, you're allowed freedom to act. If you step outside, you're treated like anyone else who disobeys orders. That's the modern system of thought control.